Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of ClueCon Weekly. Joining us this week is Andrew Knight, also known as Pandy, a testing enthusiast and senior product director at Cycle Labs. Senior director of product management. Sorry, got the title wrong. But thank you very much for joining us, Andrew.
Thanks for inviting me. It's nice to meet y'all.
Well, first of all, we'd like to start with a quick intro about yourself.
Sure, absolutely. So, as you said, my name is Andy Knight. I have been in the world of testing and automation pretty much my whole career. I'm known as the Automation Panda. That's kind of like my alter ego, my code name, if you will. But basically, I've done testing at many different companies. I've led test automation projects. I've worked at different test automation vendors. And currently now I work at one called Cycle Labs based in Raleigh, North Carolina, where we focus on delivering an excellent test automation platform targeting enterprise level systems, specifically in supply chain and warehouse management. And I've been there for, a year and a half now. I lead product management now, which is weird, because I feel like at heart, I'm an engineer, right? I build solutions to testing problems. But within the company about half a year ago, there was a need for product management. And they said, Andy, can you lead this for us? I said, sure, I'll try it. And it's been an interesting role because I get to build vicariously, right? I get to say what's on our roadmap. I get to chart product strategy. I get to work with the engineers in terms of building out what the solutions look like. And so rather than me being the one in the trenches doing all the coding, it's now more like I'm giving direction and I'm putting together things at a feature level. So it's still building solutions to testing problems. It's just in a bigger way, I suppose.
Yeah, testing has been, again, I've been doing testing for a long time. I started out learning how to test on Ruby in using RSpec, and I've been doing that since. I've wrote a suite of matchers. I've done a lot of work like that, so it's very interesting to me. But maybe we can start from a step back. When you talk about testing, how do you define testing? What are the main areas?
Ooh, excellent question. Testing is interaction plus verification. You do something and you make sure it works. Everything derives from there. So when we look at all these different kinds of testing and areas of testing, right? The one common thread is interaction. You twiddle with it, you exercise behavior, you make it do something, and verification. Did it meet my expectation of some form? If you have interaction without verification, you simply have automation. If you have verification without interaction, how did you even get there? I don't know. There's smoke and mirrors. So you can look at it like there's two main kinds of testing. There's functional testing, which is where we are trying to verify the correctness of a behavior according to specification, with the result being discrete. It is pass or fail, true or false, it worked or it didn't. Or you could look at it in terms of performance testing. How well did a behavior work according to some continuous metric, right? Where you could look at your classic system metrics like CPU utilization, memory usage, throughput, and response time. Or you could be looking at some other kind of performance metric, like how well did a particular AI agent or LLM answer your question? That would be a performance test too, right? So, and then it can just go from there.
Yeah. Then one thing I would like to start from for the next question is there is a big difference between code coverage and actual testing. A lot of teams get caught up with getting, especially in the Ruby world, where there's a certain way of doing things that's very opinionated. Like there's really only one library, people are using one and a half. And people get caught up with, okay, I have 95% code coverage. I'm certainly not going to have any problems. But instead, how do you pick the right areas to test? What's the process, especially if you haven't never done much testing? How do you pick the right things?
Well, I think with that line of thinking, it is important to note that there is a distinction between testing code and testing features, right? When we're testing code, that's where you have unit tests. That's where you look at code coverage, and you're looking at from the white box perspective of hands-on code, calling the methods and functions and all directly. does this code do what I intend? Right. And so that's where, like, yeah, code coverage can be useful because you can see, oh, did I branch through all the different paths of the code? Because there's this hypothesis that if a test touches the code in all the paths, then I must have covered it and it's okay. So like it's not a foolproof metric, but at least
Yeah.
that can show you some areas you're missing within your code. The problem is code coverage does very little for testing features or behavior because there's a big difference from the way in which something was implemented in code and the actual business value of a feature delivered to an end user. And so it's, I think a lot of developers get tunnel vision on the unit testing side, on the um, code coverage side, and they don't understand that just because you built something in the code according to spec doesn't mean that you've actually built something of value to the end user or that the thing that you built of value actually does work and deliver the value that was intended. Right, that's
Yeah,
where you
that's the
need more human oriented testing. And that could be a subject matter expert playing around with it for a little bit. That could be you have an end-to-end automated test suite with, if you've got like a web app, have something like Playwright or Cypress in there manipulating like a user would. um, and and so there needs to be that higher level of consciousness, so to speak, to be like,
right.
no,
Yeah.
you need to do testing at multiple levels here, right? And I would say the two big ones would be white box and black box. When you look in the code to make sure the code is
Hmm.
doing what you expect, and black box from outside the code, actually using it like a product, right? Does it actually perform the task? Does it actually deliver the value?
Yeah, I've seen black box testing, especially, is something that many teams struggle to introduce. But internally at SingleWire, we have a small suite of black box tests that run end to end every time a new deployment is done, every time. And that is like 20 scenarios, but it saved us so many times. Like, all
Yeah.
right, yeah, that's everything look good, but somehow phone calls are not working. No,
Hmm.
no, then that's wrong.
Yep. Yep. I mean, sometimes you never know till you slap it together, you know? Like
Yeah.
I like to think of what was it back in the late 90s, NASA sent that Mars orbiter. They spent however many jillions of dollars to send this probe to Mars. And as soon as it gets to Mars after like 2 or 3 years sailing through space, it just burns up in the Martian atmosphere. And they're like, what happened? And it turned out
Oh,
that they didn't do
yeah.
proper integration testing because one module was done in metric units, like meters and centimeters and stuff. And the other module that they put it with was done in inches. And they
Oh, I
didn't do the
remember
conversion. And
that.
it was like,
I,
well, they unit tested this one, they unit tested this one, they smack them together, and oops.
I remember that happening. Yeah, and it was something like the parachute that was to be deployed was
Yeah.
supposed to deploy at 300 meters, which is
Yeah.
almost 900 feet. But instead, the US team deployed it at 300 feet because it said 300. And it was like one third of the distance required to slow down enough to
Yeah. And
actually.
it's like
It,
smashed into the planet or something at high speed.
it
Just like,
didn't work, so to say. So, yeah, there's. And well, I think another then going down that path. How do you pick the features to test? Like any
mm,
testing is better than no testing, but
yes.
how do you pick what you want to test? Let's make it even a more complicated scenario. I
Sure.
am a team of developers, let's say a small team,
Mhm.
which has a product, and we have no tests at
Oh,
all.
I'm so
We
sorry.
realize we have no tests.
Mhm.
How do we get into the mindset?
Mm. Sure. So first of all, the team needs to admit that they need some sort of test coverage to protect themselves. Because if this is a team that is fighting the idea of doing any sort of testing and automation, it's never going to fly. Right. There needs to be some spark in that organization to say, oh shoot, we need this. And hopefully it's not somebody from the top down dictating it, but it's actually like common sense of the engineers saying, oh shoot, we have a gap. So assuming that has happened. Um, the in terms of building a testing strategy, the first thing to look at would be your most valuable behaviors, your MVBs. What would be the things that if they break, it's game over, nothing works, there's massive loss to the business, massive loss to customer usage, whatever metric you define as being the most important thing, right? What are the critical behaviors on that path that you absolutely know that must be working? Um, those would be the first things to get your automated test coverage on. And I would say automated test coverage because anybody can just go um, um, uh, like bang on a keyboard and stuff and play around,
Mm.
right? Most developers are doing that anyway. They'll build the thing, they'll check the thing real quick, and they'll ship it, right? Um, but if there's anything that is absolutely business critical, get coverage
Mhm.
on that first because if you make a bad push to prod and that goes down, ooh, you have a very bad weekend ahead of you. And I think a lot of people overthink this, right? This is the 80/20 rule here. A lot of the most valuable stuff is actually pretty straightforward for most systems. Things like, can you actually log into the app? You
Yeah.
know, if let's say you're doing a banking app, can you log into the app? Can you see an account? Can you initiate a transfer? Like these very basic kinds of things that most developers will be like, oh yeah, that's we can write some tests for that. We just know what that is. Um, to get some sense of coverage on those things, to automate them in expedited time, and then this is another important thing to put those tests into continuous integration. Um, I think
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of teams go wrong in that they'll start this whole huge automation epic and they'll just start spinning wheels, churning out script after script after script, tens, hundreds, thousands of test cases, but then they'll never actually have the system to run them. Right. They might be automated tests in the execution of the test, but then when it comes time to actually launch them, the triggering is still manual. What I believe is as soon as you write your first test, get it into continuous integration, integrate it into your pipeline, get it delivering value. For a team, that could be, they every time that there is a pull request or a build kicked off, it just runs the unit test, then it runs the feature level tests. It could be that if the black box level tests start taking a little too long, maybe you schedule it at certain hours of the day, or maybe you do it once overnight, and that's okay. Um, I wouldn't go further past nightly. When teams start to do it weekly, then the feedback loop is too slow, right? Because what you want is you want immediate feedback on things so that during a daytime, if developer pushes a change, I want to know within one business day if it broke one of the most valuable behaviors, right?
Yeah.
And that initial test suite, I mean, it might just be a smoke suite or something. It might be like, oh, well, that seems really basic, really simple. Trust me. Sometimes the simple things are the best things. Once they get that in place, then they can start to unpack, okay, what are the next areas that we have time and capacity for to add valuable test coverage for? And as they add that, they can add them straight into that continuously running test suite.
Yeah, the happy path is going to save you a lot of headaches. Just that, like literally, just test the normal flow. If your application is e-commerce, as you said, just test that the user can log in, put
Mhm.
an item in their cart, and
Mhm.
go and purchase it. If you have that tested, you're very well on your way to a good experience. Because then, I mean, if people cannot buy from your store, that's a
Yeah,
big problem.
yeah, yeah. I mean, another way to look at it is determining should I spend time automating this test or not? Um, would anybody care if that test failed?
Hmm.
Right? Would anyone care if they saw a red X from a test report for that particular behavior? If the answer is yes, automate the test. If the answer is no, maybe don't bother. And that's a great way to be just brutally honest with yourself about like what matters here.
Yeah, totally agree. It's again, if you have a test that if it fails, it doesn't matter. I almost want to say that the entire feature is under scrutiny. Like you,
Yeah.
you even need that in your application, but then
Mhm.
that's a different story for. Okay, so yeah, for more software development discussion at large, like if you have an entire feature whose tests are failing and nobody cares, uh,
Yeah.
what
There's
is that?
something somewhere very broken
Yeah.
because either the feature doesn't matter or the people are shipping poor quality and don't care.
Yeah,
one or the other.
yes, it can be. Most likely, it's the first. Honestly, we all have our features that we built, and they're sort of sitting there, and you never really check them on them. But still, failing tests is not acceptable. Another remark I want to do is in Ruby, especially, there are a lot of things you get taught when you start programming that only work if you're testing. Like the whole refactoring thing, like red green refactor. It only works if you have
Mm,
tests. You cannot refactor without tests. It literally doesn't work.
true, true.
And then people get into, if you refactor without testing it, just you wouldn't even remember where things were, which is going to kill you.
Uh,
Cool. So,
yeah.
well, let's say I have this application. I finally managed to convince my my team to build some tests. They're running, etc. And they start to like it, and we hit it off, and the company starts growing. Automated testing is super heavy. How do you scale that? Like, I don't want to
Mm,
wait 4 hours for a test suite to run, because that sort of kills the. That will make people
yeah.
not run it. That's my experience as a manager.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, yeah. This is a great question. There are a couple things that folks can do. Um, First of all, I would say people have to be mindful of when they run which tests, right? Um, the whole purpose of automated testing is to get fast feedback on the quality that has been put into the product. And so it is very important to inform people as quickly as possible after they submit a change into the system, whether or not that was a good change or a bad change in terms of did you break something bad. And so there needs to be, in my belief, that smoke suite, that quick running test suite that runs continuously for every single change or very, very, very quickly periodically. And you can't put every single test that a team has owned or a company has owned into that smoke suite. There has to be brutal prioritization. So that's where it's like you would look at what are the most valuable behaviors I can smash into that, um, and possibly, I favor keeping a tight time window versus
Mhm.
adding more coverage in. The way I look at the smoke suite challenge, the continuous suite challenge is how much coverage can I smash into this suite and still have it complete within 10 minutes, 15 minutes. So that way that's almost instantaneous.
Yeah.
And then all the other tests have to go on a schedule, right? That would be your nightly runs. And I mean, I think most teams they could probably shunt all of their extra tests in a nightly run, and that's okay. But some teams are so big that then they have to start playing scheduling with nightlies, right? Where maybe they have, they have to run it on different configurations. They might have to round robin every other day of the week or something. So there's that aspect of you have to manage your suites like that. Second aspect is once you've got your suite management in place, how do you scale the tests themselves so that you can cram more coverage into less time, right? You can't change the flow of time. The flow of time is fixed, but you can do things to get more coverage into that time boxed window. And so you need to look at things like running your tests in parallel. I know this might sound silly, but a lot of teams don't do this,
Yeah.
right? You've got to write your tests in such a way that they are all independent, that they won't collide on test data, and that you can run them in parallel at the same time. You can do that at the level of the test framework. I mean, pretty much every single automated test framework has some way that you can like put in a command line option to say run this in 4 times parallel, run this in 40 times parallel. The trick is you have
Yeah.
to actually automate your test to be able to handle that, right? Um, you could do it at the continuous integration level, like if you're using Jenkins or Azure DevOps or whatever, right? You can kind of partition your test suite and have it run on different agents, and then stitch together the results at the end. Um, and then you can also do things in terms of like scaling up your hardware and your infrastructure. Like back in the day when Selenium was kingpin of web testing, right? You could use Selenium Grid to spread out all the different browser sessions that were happening. And Selenium Grid was performant, man. Like I had it going up to like 100 concurrent sessions
Wow.
across a huge no. Oh yeah, Like there are you can performance tune it. What's your appropriate ratio of processors to test and all that. And so like on a previous team, we had gotten to a point where we could run 1,000 Selenium based end-to-end tests in like a 10-minute window, just by huge hyper scale parallelization with Selenium Grid and being smart about how we do our setup and cleanup.
That's insane. Yeah, it
Yep.
is. It's well, Playwright and the newer tools are also very, very good and very.
Yeah, and that's the other thing I was going to mention. If you really want to go fast with web testing, like Playwright right now is just by far the fastest, the most efficient in terms of execution. So it's like, I mean, if speed really is a concern, consider choosing that as your tool.
I've used it as an automation tool also, like just to go get stuff from website, etc.
Oh yeah,
pretty nicely. Well, that leads into another portion of our discussion, which is errors you can make while testing and things. For example, what you mentioned is how do you make your tests parallelizable? You can make your test parallel, whatever. It's you have to make sure your test don't depend on state that it's stats from another test, which is a common mistake I've seen, where people write 4 tests which depend on what was done on the database record in the previous, right? So the first test creates the user, the second test checks that the user is lookup, and that's the first thing. No, that's in fact, I always advocate, if your framework does it, most of them do, run your tests in a random order. It's probably the simplest way to weed those out.
Yes, I say that too. 100%. 100%. Yeah.
It's too easy to get caught into that. Oh, great, it's working. But it's working because you spent 20 tests before that to set up the state. So obviously it works.
Yeah. No, I agree completely. Test case independence to me is a first order issue. If there are
what
tests,
else can go wrong?
Sorry, what?
What else do you think can go wrong when you're doing testing? Like what to avoid aside from independence?
So yeah, the test case independence issue is huge, because if a team has implemented a suite like that, the suite is ruined to me. Like, start over. You literally have to start over. I don't accept it. I don't negotiate with that. I run away from those projects. So that one, first of all. Secondly, when it comes to black box style testing, big issue would be handling weighting appropriately. Because anytime you have black box systems, you inherently have race conditions, where you, at the very least, you have the system under test going on its own process, and then you have the automation process trying to test it on the other process, right? And so if you trigger an interaction and a thing happens and then you try to check something before it's ready, boom, right? Synchronization issues. Those have been the bane of end-to-end testing forever. And when people don't handle those race conditions with appropriate weighting, that also just ruins test suites. I think this was felt most acutely in the past with web-based testing with Selenium WebDriver, because that was one of the first cases where you had a large number of testers and developers and engineers coming into black box end-to-end style automated testing en masse with a free and open source tool. So it just floodgates were opened. But Selenium itself is not a web testing framework. It's just an engine, right? It's just for browser automation, and it has very low level API. And so it doesn't do weighting for you. You have to do weighting. Most people didn't realize this. And so when they say, oh, I want to do like, driver.getElement.click, boom, I clicked it. Now I should be able to go forward, right? It's like, no, you clicked it. Yes. Now you have to wait for the thing that you wanted to appear. And when they didn't do that, shoot, my test is flaky. Oh, the Selenium is flaky. It's like, no. Selenium's not flaky. Your tests are flaky because you didn't use Selenium right. Now, to that, I would also say Selenium's developer experience was rather poor with that. And the Selenium project took a very opinionated stance that they would not fix that kind of issue, right? They would say, well, that's just the way Selenium works. It's like, yeah, well, but you have the entire world using it one way, and there's mismatched expectations. And now we're all in the mess that we're in, right? And then you see subsequent frameworks like Cypress and Playwright come out, where they're like, yeah, of course we're going to do automatic weighting. Why wouldn't you? Side eye, right? And so now when somebody in Playwright or Cypress says click, it actually will wait for the element and then click it. So
yeah, there's
that the weighting thing is being solved better, I guess.
you need low level JavaScript knowledge to get some of the stuff actually done. But other than that, it's it's part of the course. I mean, it's browsers, it's language, it's JavaScript.
Yes, yes.
I'm
trying to think other issues. I mean, I guess another big issue I would see is that people are not writing their test cases well. When we're developing a robust, scalable test automation project, we really need tests to be short and sweet. We want atomic tests. We want each test to cover one individual behavior independently. And the reason why is because when we run all of these things, every single interaction an automated test makes is a possible point of failure.
Yeah, right.
You know, it's like, and it's very common for these things to fail because automation is tied to the system, and so if there's any change in the system, the automation becomes very brittle and can break. And so we want those breakages to be minimal, right? They're inevitable because systems will change. That's what software development is. So it's not a matter of eliminating fragility completely. It's more of limiting how much it can happen and for what reason. And so I want my test to be short and atomic so that there's the greater chance of success that it will reach completion. And also, when I look at my test report afterwards, that'll have tens, hundreds, thousands of results. When I see the title of the test, I want to know exactly what behavior that was, right? And what I see, unfortunately, and this is more indicative of folks who come from a more like traditional manual testing background. They'll write these grand tours of tests.
Yeah.
Why? Because when you're the human, you want to hit everything in one pass. But then they'll go automate that grand tour as one test case. And now you have like 17 different behaviors crammed in here. And if it fails on the third, well, the test will abort and you've actually lost coverage for everything from 4 through 17.
Yeah, you didn't even know if the rest worked, right? It's
exactly. So it's like,
there.
let's split those up. let's make them.
So here's a very technical question about that.
Okay.
Mocking. How do you feel about how deep do you go into mocking? For example, there are some end-to-end tests will do complicated things that might even get expensive, especially in this day and age of LLMs, right? It's easy to rack up $1 or $2 of OpenAI interactions in the course of a test, which doesn't sound like much until you realize you're running the test 50 times a day. And then it's the salary of developer just going to OpenAI for testing. So how do you manage balancing the need for true testing with mocking out resources? Another option, another example could be phone calls. SignalWire is a real-time communications company, so we run phone calls during end-to-end tests. But that suit is purposefully kept short because one phone call will take a couple minutes end-to-end, right? That's the minimum time for something to happen. If you have 100 of those, cost is not a problem. They're very cheap at our level, but it's more about it will take you an hour to run those calls. So, but maybe you don't need to fully test the call itself. Maybe you don't want the voice. Like the SignalWire system will emit webhooks, events, callbacks when something's happening in the call. So should I actually call someone and check the callbacks are getting emitted? Or where do you draw the line? Where do you mock and what you don't mock? It's hard to balance both.
It is absolutely. So my disposition on this is I prefer to mock as little as possible as a principle. The reason why is because mocking takes a lot of effort. It is typically fairly complicated to do. I mean, there are tools, there are practices, but I mean, essentially, with a mock, you're making a stand-in for something else when maybe it could be better to use the original, right? So, I've seen a lot of teams spend a lot of time building mocks and still having gaps in their test coverage because the mock didn't behave the way that the real world did, and so there was a test gap. Or they spend a lot of time perpetually maintaining these mocks because the thing that it is mocking is changing as well. And so there's friction and frustration there that happens. Furthermore, one could also argue that in times, in certain cases, not all, but in certain cases where a team feels like they need a mock because it's too hard to put the real thing in place, maybe that's the code smell that says this original thing is rather untestable, you know. So there's those kinds of issues that it covers. But at the same time, that is not a universal statement because, like you said, there are certain cases where the cost of using an original is too dang high, right? And that could be a cost in terms of money, like you said, you're spending all of your developer salary going to OpenAI to check this LLM, or it could be in terms of time because there's a a phone call that takes an hour to complete or something, and it, the time thing as well. Like there's like system checks that you want to make sure something kicks off every day or so. Are you really going to automate a test to wait 24 hours? No, right? So in those cases where the cost, whether it's money or time or something else, are exorbitant, that would be the times I would say, okay, it's worth it to use a mock, right? Um, Otherwise, I would strongly prefer to just use the original thing and set up the system in a way such that it is easy to integrate those pieces together. And if they are not easily integratable, raise that up as a concern of architecture to be like, look, this inherently is untestable. We need to make changes to make it easier to spin these up, deploy these, have a test instance that can also ship to prod, those kinds of things.
Yeah. Oh, I think it's all. It's important to. One thing I want to point out about mocks is just make sure you're not testing against something you made up, because there's
Oh
some
yeah,
situations where
yeah.
people just
Oh yeah.
don't just the API says it responds like it, so why should I actually test the API, right? It's saying it's going to work like that. The other thing we can say is that I've done a lot of testing with LLMs recently. Most of the major providers, like we use OpenAI, Google, you can also use a seed to make sure the response is always the same, which effectively takes the LLM out of the loop. So you can trust that.
Sure.
You can trust that the
Right.
request with that seed will be the same response, so you don't need to actually do it every time.
Good.
That's very, very important. Okay, well, Andrew, well, thank you very much for joining us today. I mean, we did a lot of very good exploration and word testing. I think there's got a lot of good insight here. And there's going to be links below the video to reach out to Andrew, and if there's anything else you'd like to see. And I know you're a prolific speaker, so looking forward to meet you at some conference here and there. I'll be traveling a bit more next year.
Wonderful.
Wonderful. Spend a lot of time spinning up the European side of the business, but now I can travel a bit more, so I'll be happy to join a few conferences. I need some technical exposure back, so it's it's gonna be fun. So, well, Andrew, thank you for joining us today. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for inviting me. It was a lot of fun.
And for the rest of the people, I'll see you next week. Goodbye.